sacrifice. It's such an ominous word, right? A word that elicits dread and foreboding. So why do we use it when we're trying to encourage people to live their best life? And we say things like making sacrifices is the only way you'll ever reach any level of success, happiness, love, whatever. And although that sentiment may be true, why do we make it sound so negative? And as deliberate thinkers, can't we shift our mindset so that we can look at making sacrifices as a positive thing? So that we don't focus on what we're losing, but rather on what we're gaining, which is bound to be of greater value. Well, that's exactly what we're going to try to do today, folks, by discussing three things. We're going to discuss the value of making sacrifices, and then we're going to discuss three categories of sacrifice that I came up with, and what can be gained by making each one of those sacrifices. And we'll start discussing the value of sacrifice with this statement. We make sacrifices to ease suffering. Now, this may seem like an overly simplistic statement, but it really showcases the value of making sacrifices in a very succinct way, because its message is clear. The purpose of sacrifice is not to cause suffering. The purpose of sacrifice is to alleviate long-term or future suffering. And this mindset really comes from the Stoic philosophers, because they recognized the value of sacrifice by believing that if one lived a life of virtue, that this virtuous life would lead to freedom from suffering. But living a virtuous life isn't easy, and living a virtuous life is most definitely going to require quite a few sacrifices. For starters, you have to sacrifice your idealism, your comforts, your pleasures, your cowardice, your self-righteousness. But if you could sacrifice each of these things, wouldn't your life have more value? And because you would be well adjusted, you would be wise, maybe even a bit calmer, and possessing all of these qualities would lead you to a life of minimal suffering. So, what you're gaining is greater than the sacrifice. Because after all, you can't control the external world. None of us can. It's going to try to break you down. But what you can control is how you react to it. You can control whether you suffer or not by learning to control your emotions and your impulses. And the way that you learn to control your emotions and impulses is through sacrifice, by sacrificing short-term pleasures and comforts. And this is what the Stoic philosophers recognized. So that's one value of sacrifice, is that you ease your suffering. The next value of sacrifice is that sacrifice helps us find meaning in our lives. And I found a quote from Viktor Frankl that really brings this point home. And if you're not sure who he is, he was a well-regarded neurologist and psychiatrist, but he was also a Holocaust survivor. And one of his claims to fame was logotherapy, which is a type of psychotherapy that he developed. And he was speaking about logotherapy when he said this. Logotherapy considers man as a being whose main concern consists of fulfilling a meaning and in actualizing values, rather than in the mere gratification and satisfaction of drives and instincts. So to me, what that says is you have to sacrifice your gratification and satisfaction in order to live a life of meaning and to actualize your values. And this is a really powerful statement, especially coming from Frankl, because when you think about it, this guy lived in a concentration camp for 4 years, or no, I guess he was in them for 3 years. Yeah, 3 years. But, he was in 4 different concentration camps during that time. And during that time, he lost his wife, he lost his mother, his father, his brother, everyone close to him. He witnessed atrocities we can't even imagine, probably some of the worst atrocities man has ever committed. Yet he was still able to find meaning in his life and come out of that and give some value to the world afterwards. And it was because he sacrificed everything except for one thing, the freedom to choose his attitude. And this is another quote from him. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. So, what I take from that is that you can make sacrifices and they will lead to your meaning no matter what your situation in life is. So yes, Frankl was forced to make the sacrifices that I'm referring to, and his sacrifices were far greater than the sacrifices we're going to talk about today. But still, his sacrifices had value. They ultimately led him to a life of meaning, which is something that a lot of us will never realize And so that to me speaks a lot. Now we've talked about two values of sacrifice. Now it's time to discuss some of the categories that I've outlined and what kinds of sacrifices we should consider. So I've come up with 3 different categories for which the value of the sacrifice is much less than the value of what could be gained. And the categories are time and money, comfort and gratification, and then ego and pride. So we're going to discuss each one and figure out what greater value could be gained by making each of these sacrifices. So we'll start with time and money. I put these together because they're interrelated in that they both offer us an opportunity if we spend or sacrifice them wisely. And these opportunities allow us to create something greater than what we started with. So let's consider a couple of very simple examples that most people can relate to in some way. Regarding money, you sacrifice part of your paycheck every pay period to go into your retirement account. You do this because the value of that sacrifice is that the value of the security you receive from knowing that you're going to be able to retire someday. And that value is greater than the value of that money in your pocket today. So that maybe you were just going to spend it on something you didn't need anyway. Another simple example regarding time is that you sacrifice 4 years of your life to go to college. And you do this because the value of the career that you hope to gain is greater than the value of the time that you're sacrificing to go to school. So those are a couple very simple examples. And now let's talk about a couple of personal examples of mine to kind of bring it home even more. So once upon a time, I sacrificed a significant pay increase when I switched CPA firms. And that was not because I took a pay cut, but it was because the firm I was at was willing to pay me a substantial amount more to stay with them. But I decided not to go with the money. I decided to go to the new firm because it offered a work environment that suited my needs much better. And the value of that was much greater to me in the long run than the money. And an example of when I sacrificed time was that I once sacrificed 3 years of my life to conceive my sweet little baby girl, who is now 11 and hates it when I call her my sweet little baby girl, but I'm going to do it anyway. So essentially, I put my life on hold because my whole life pretty much revolved around trying to conceive her. And I put my life on hold for approximately 3 years, but what I received in exchange was value of love beyond words. And I received the value of having pride in her every single day. That it makes it, the value of those two things is so much greater than the time that I gave up. So you see, when we talk about sacrifice in this way, it doesn't sound like a negative thing, right? And it doesn't sound so ominous or foreboding. So let's keep going and let's talk about some more examples here. So the next category is comfort and gratification. We all long for comfort, whether it be comfort, the physical comforts of a cozy blanket or the emotional comfort of a loving hug. But sacrificing some comforts and gratifications will give us something of greater value in the long run, and that greater value is long-term success and fulfillment. So we're going to consider a couple cliche examples here, just so maybe you can relate to these. So you sacrifice the comfort of your couch to exercise because you know that taking care of your body is going to give you more value in the long run. It's going to give you greater fulfillment than watching whatever binge-worthy show you're watching at the moment. And as far as sacrificing your time goes, we're not talking about sacrificing time anymore. Sorry. Let's back up a minute. We're talking about sacrificing gratification now. You sacrifice the gratification of eating a warm cookie, say, because you know that the value of meeting your long-term fitness goals is greater than the 20 seconds of pleasure that you're going to receive from eating that cookie. And then I have a couple not so obvious examples of sacrificing comfort and gratification. So sometimes you have to sacrifice the comfort of the uncomfortable. And you might be thinking, what the heck does that mean? And I know it sounds crazy, but when you stop and really think about it, it is true that we tend to find comfort in self-pity and misery because those feelings are familiar to us. And that makes them hard to sacrifice. Yet we know that the only way we're going to break free of the situation that's keeping us feeling the feelings of self-pity and misery is to sacrifice them and to find the value on what's waiting on the other side. And that means we're going to have to sacrifice our pity party. So that's one example of sacrificing comfort that might not be so obvious. And another sacrificing gratification, another example of sacrificing gratification is that, I'll take a personal example. I'm working right now on delaying the gratification of checking things off my list. Because you probably could figure out if you read anything or know anything about me. I love making lists and I love checking things off of them. However, if I opt for the instant gratification of just checking things off a list, I'm bound to try to do the easy to-dos first. And those easy to-dos probably are not going to be the ones that are going to lead to my long-term success and fulfillment. And they're not going to have the most impact on those things. So I really need to be focusing on the harder things, which I'm not going to be able to check off my list as quickly. But I have to sacrifice that instant gratification and be happy with maybe only getting one or two things crossed off my list. And in exchange, I will return long-term sacrifice and fulfillment. Alright, so now we are on to the third and final category, which is ego and pride. There are going to be turning points in your life when you have to sacrifice your ego and pride in exchange for the greater value of peace of mind and self-respect. And we're going to go through a few examples, of course. So think about this. You're arguing with someone, and your ego and pride want to throw every wrong they've ever done, all of their flaws. You want to throw all these things in their face. But you also know that if you do that, you're going to feel horrible at the end of the day. So if you catch yourself and you sacrifice your pride and your ego in that moment, you'll receive the greater long-term value of peace of mind and self-respect. And here's another example that you might be able to relate to. You've been working on a new project for quite a while, let's say 6 months to a year. It hasn't gone as planned and your heart just isn't in it anymore and you're starting to feel like maybe this is not the right path for me. But your ego and your pride will not let you fail. They don't want to accept that your idea failed. So you keep going through the motions, but you're not getting any results. But you just keep pushing with no results. This may be the time that it's time to sacrifice your ego and your pride. And then you can start finding the greater values and the lessons to be learned from the failure, if you want to call it a failure. But there's lessons there, if you look for them. And also, by doing that, you're going to gain resilience. And that resilience is going to give you self-respect. That's going to be greater than the ego and pride you had to sacrifice. And we'll end this with another personal example of mine, and it's one that I reflect on often. So it was back when my ex-husband and I were trying to determine how we were going to split up our time with our daughter Emma. And he had asked if he could have Emma on the same weekends that his girlfriend had her kids. And of course, my ego and pride immediately, my gut just said, no. I'm not giving them every other weekend to themselves. That's crazy. And why is he even asking me this? And of course, my ego and pride wanted to laugh in his face and say, are you serious right now? But I didn't. I stopped myself and I chose peace of mind and self-respect instead. And doing that, what happened was, by doing that, I ended up meeting my husband, Dan. Because we happened to be out on the same weekend because we didn't have our kids on that weekend. And if I would have chosen my ego and pride instead, I would have been home with my daughter Emma that night, and I wouldn't have met Dan. And I wouldn't have gained all the valuable things that I've gained since I met him. So that sacrifice in that moment of my ego and pride was definitely worth it in the long run. So I've given you a lot of examples. We've talked about a lot of things here. Now that your juices are flowing, let's start asking you a few questions. Hopefully you're thinking of some examples of sacrifices you've made, and hopefully you're starting to maybe identify the value of those sacrifices. And now the question is, was the value of what you gained greater than what you sacrificed? And then start thinking about, is there something that you need to think about sacrificing now or sacrificing in the near future to receive something of greater value? And remember, sacrifice doesn't have to have a negative connotation. That's the whole point of this. That's we're trying to see the value rather than the negative side of the sacrifice. It's really just up to you and your mindset. So you have to ask yourself, do you want to focus on the trivial value of this, whatever it is you're sacrificing, or do you want to focus on the significant value of what you had to gain by making the sacrifice? And if you need a bit more guidance to answer that question, of course, you know I put a worksheet together for you that's going to help you figure that out. It's going to help you go from inspiration to action. So check that out. Go back to the narrative post, and there's going to be a link to the worksheet there. And until next time, stay curious.